So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ms. Heather Pinnock to the stage.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Good morning. Oh, morning. Good morning. It's been a long morning. It is my absolute pleasure to be here, and more so, it's my pleasure to talk about one of my favorite topics. I really, really, really like buildings. I forgot the clicker. It's a strange thing to like, I suppose, but I really like buildings. I'm fascinated by buildings. I'm fascinated by everything about buildings. And I think this all started when I was 13 years old, and I think that was maybe my lucky year. When I was 13, I experienced a hurricane for the first time in my life. And I was home with my sisters and my parents and my dog, and we had a hurricane. It came in the night, and it was terrifying. It was the most scary thing that had ever happened in my whole 13 years of existence at that point. And at one moment in the middle of the night, after creaking and bumping and making lots of noise, there was a moment in the night where our roof lifted. And I stood there in my living room, the roof lifted, and all of a sudden I could see outside. And the wind came in, the rain came in, the lightning came in, and the little leaves, it's a very unique thing about hurricanes. They're like thousands of little tiny leaves. And the little leaves came in and stuck all over my face. And I stood there in a mix of horror and amazement. I was like, oh wow, I hadn't really thought about how much this house was protecting me before, but in this moment, I really love my house. And thereafter, I became obsessed with understanding this thing. How this thing that somebody before me made, how did they design it? How did they put it together? How did it work? How can I do this? And so I studied architecture. And then I said, I've done architecture. This is interesting. I know to do buildings, but then look, places flood and stuff. So what else can I do? And so I went and I did urban design. And then I said, how do we make this? So I went and did construction. And I did construction project management. And then I said, okay, what are the other things that support buildings? And I got into understanding infrastructure and water and roads and all the other stuff. And so all this to say, in my whole arc of growing up to this point, I have been fascinated and obsessed with buildings, and now that I have retired from government finally, I spend all my time really thinking about how to make the absolute best places for us to live, work, and play. And so that is my introduction to me and what I'm going to talk about today, which is very, very wide view of development. But to speak very specifically about development, these things that we build, these things that we create, apart from being the spaces that we live, to get down to the technical stuff from people like IMF, for both individuals and for economies, home ownership, that is actually purchasing a building that is ours, is the biggest source of both debt and wealth. So obviously, a core part of our economies. And a big part of me understanding building and the built environment is how we do this sustainably. So sustainable development is one of the things I talk about the most, actually. And I talk about it in every aspect, but of course, my favorite would be how we relate sustainable development to property, to buildings. And this quote, which is almost as old as me now, this quote from the Brundtland Report is frequently used to define sustainable development, and I think it is so perfect that I continue to use it, and I may use it for another 30 or 40 years. But essentially, sustainable development is development that fulfills the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to make their own needs. And this point was raised in the previous panel, that we make decisions today and now, but we must always leave room for awesome things that come in the future. So I have realized there was a point where I was the one who came up with fantastic new and exciting things, but I realized that I'm maturing a bit now. I had a young GIS technician who worked with me at the Urban Development Corporation in Jamaica, and he came to me he was submitting an application to do a master's degree in digital earth. No, I had no idea what that was. What's digital earth? I don't know, but you know what I do know? I know that he's going to be awesome at it. I know he's going to change the world in some way that I absolutely do not understand right in this moment, but my job at that moment was to facilitate him to go and be great. And that's the essence of sustainable development, that we fulfill what we need to do today. We don't want to be suffering today, but we also need to leave space for things that we cannot imagine. We simply cannot imagine. And sustainable development is essentially the triple constraint, the balancing of three key things. And because I'm a teacher in my heart too, I use the 3 Ps because it helps people to remember. It really is society, environment, and the economy. But the 3 Ps, to make it simple, is people, planet, and profit. I think this is the core of everything. In every decision, in every thought, just think to yourself, how am I balancing people, planet, and profit in this that I'm doing? And then you'll know, just a simple exercise, if you're achieving sustainability. This, I think, is so important that it's actually the basis of the logo for my company, the 3 interlocking, the little Venn diagram here. So being able to balance these 3 things is really the core of what's sustainable. And then, of course, globally, we have agreed that sustainability is important, and we have the Sustainable Development Goals. United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which we are quite advanced in that process. The goals are for 2030. And then, in fact, I assume pretty soon, UN will start talking about what's going to come after those Sustainable Development Goals. But of those 17 goals, the construction industry, development, and all the things that we were talking about today really relate a lot to those goals. Again, land use patterns, the way we plan and design, the way we use materials and stuff really affects greenhouse gas emissions. The way we build and the way we unbuild, the way we take down and renew, something that might not be happening as much in Bermuda, but that I see happening in increasing amounts now, where things that were built, things that existed for a long time are being demolished and new things are popping up. And I used to say, be careful before you dig a hole, because when you pour that cement, it's probably going to be there a while. But the way things are changing, maybe not so much. But how we use that, the circularity of how we build and what we do. And then, of course, the activities around something like housing that touches everybody obviously has the opportunity that if unregulated or corrupt practices come in, it can have strong effects on our society, on our politics, and on our economics. And at the core, housing, shelter is a basic need, and the availability and affordability of it is a major part of quality of life. And the construction industry and development in general provides such solid basis for economic growth and employment. So all across the industry, it touches so many of the Sustainable Development Goals. I've highlighted my favorite, of course, which is Sustainable Cities and Communities, which kind of encapsulates all of the development work that we do. But to talk now specifically about the SDGs and housing. Housing is so important because apart from just all the buildings we use for all the various parts of life and activity, housing derives outcomes for the very individual and at every level. So it drives outcomes in health, in education, in standards of living. It includes indicators for a variety of things from nutrition, child mortality, school enrollment, use of energy, use of water, improvements in sanitation, and opportunities to extend sustainable construction. Housing, from a philosophical point of view now, creates a sense of place and dignity, an important part of personal self-actualization and recognition of one's place in the world. And it's an important part of building community and social and financial frameworks, the very core of our social and financial frameworks. Adequate and affordable housing has proven to give us a multiplier effect on jobs, incomes, financial stability of households, and providing opportunities, particularly most recently, since the pandemic. We've seen where a lot of business, a lot of economic activity is actually taking place inside homes at a rate it didn't before the pandemic. And so overall, housing is a prerequisite for inclusive, equitable, safe, and resilient and sustainable cities, which is at the core of any development guidelines we're looking at for the Sustainable Development Goals. Now let's talk about impact. A well-functioning housing sector is critical to the health of the society, to every economy, and to financial stability. So let's talk about the impact of the things we do, the things we build, the things I understand all these people in this room are involved in. So let's talk about some of those things by figures. 40% of global emissions come from our buildings, from the construction and real estate sector. That's really quite significant. When you think about people talking about how we can stop climate change, using better materials is not usually one of the first things that comes up right away. But it really is a big part of that. So for that 40% of the global emissions that come from building construction and our real estate sector in general, 70% of those emissions are produced by building operations. So that includes heating, cooling, and mechanical activities. So the need to keep this room cool so we're comfortable when it is winter. We don't really experience that much in the rest of in the Caribbean, but here in Bermuda, last time I was here, it was surprisingly cold for me, so I have great respect for the heating. So, we appreciate that heating and cooling uses energy in ways that significantly contribute to our global carbon emissions. The other 30%, so the 70 and 30 here is 100% of that 40%, fun math, but the other 30% of the emissions comes from the kinds of materials that we use. Again, I heard a conversation just now in the previous panel about initially starting a conversation around building materials. And building materials are really something we need to consider because so much of the energy is actually as a part of the building materials that we use, and also, particularly in small island developing states, quite a bit of those building materials we don't produce ourselves, so they have to come from somewhere else. And all of that is a significant consideration in our energy demands. So, I want to talk about now the impact of climate change on small island developing states. Because small island developing states are, I'm using the first word of course, fairly small, but really carry some of the brunt of the impact of climate change. So SIDS share traits across the globe, and including Bermuda, of a number of things, including that they may be remote, in that there's nothing right next door, close beside, to source things like steel from next door. Fairly small populations, dependence on ocean resources, reliance on imported materials and goods, limited access to finance, and vulnerability to external shocks and the impacts of climate change. And it's one of the things we find that unite SIDS all across the globe. And SIDS also bear the largest brunt of the climate impacts, including more frequent and intense extreme weather events. So storms, hurricanes, cyclones, whatever we call them across the world, floods, droughts, heat waves. So I left Jamaica 2 days ago, and it is May, and it was 42 degrees Celsius, which is obscenely hot for May. But I don't know if you know this, but Kingston, Jamaica is one of the countries in the world that has not only met but passed climate change. So our climate isn't changing anymore. It has changed. So Kingston has passed the climate tipping point and has gone into a new reality where it's just hot all the time. And that's a frightening reality for others and a frightening prospect for others, but has become the reality in Kingston. It is shockingly and unreasonably hot all the time. Then we have the risk of things like sea level rise. Some of the Caribbean countries I've worked in, they do modeling to see what happens if the sea level was to rise by various degrees. And it is amazing and distressing to see how much of those islands, how much of those countries will be lost by just half a foot, 1 foot of sea level rise, because so much of our life in the Caribbean actually happens so close to the sea. Then we have coastal erosion, which is ongoing, the ongoing effects of stronger, harsher seas. This image at the top is actually in Cuba, in Havana, where you're seeing really strong sea action, and it's one of the things that we need to consider because so much of our investment, so much of our cities are right up on the coast. And then we have things like warming seas and salination of our green water, of our freshwater resources. So let's take some more stats for our context as SIDS. 70% of people in the Caribbean live at or near sea level. So I remember once a hurricane was coming last year, and I wrote something on my social media about, my prayers for everyone in the path of this oncoming hurricane. And somebody replied and said, so why don't you guys just move? And I said, well, if there's one thing that is not easy for people in small island developing states to do, that is to just get up and go somewhere else. So one, the country is limited, and two, our ability to just move to other countries or move around the world is really quite limited. So here we are, living in coastal settlements at or near sea level. 70% of us in the Caribbean region. 50% of the year is spent under a recognized threat of storm and hurricane. June 1st will be the start of the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. We don't think about it, but June 1st to November 30th is 6 months. 6 months is half of the year, and we face this every year. And now, even though we expect and even though we might not react to it, there's a little prickly feeling in the back of your neck. Every time you see a little news item, every time you look on the map and you see a little thing starting, you're like, And maybe a lot of the time it doesn't become something. In Jamaica, we have this belief that, it's not going to come here. In Trinidad, they have a belief that God is a Trini, so it's not going to go there. But regardless of what we think, every time it starts, all of us know there's a chance. There is a chance it's going to come. There is a chance it's going to be strong. There's a chance it's going to come to my house. And that's a frightening thing to live with in a defined 6 months. That's half of the year. That's half of our lives. Half of our lives we have a little niggling feeling in the back of our heads that a storm may come. And that's quite a lot. And then this figure, which is the smallest figure I'm sharing, which I think is also the most important figure I'm sharing, is that all small island developing states, all of us together, all of us across the whole world gathered together, produce less than 1% of global carbon emissions. And that 1% that we produce does not protect us from receiving significant impacts that come. And those impacts are not only the destruction of the hurricanes, it's things like warmer air. It affects soils. I have been in St. Vincent and Dominica where they were having issues with the ability to grow certain crops because the soils were different. It was so hot. The soils were not producing what they used to produce. And the kinds of effects that this has, and the crops grow and then don't thrive because it's too hot. In fact, I'm pretty sure we're going to have to reconsider crops in Jamaica soon because it's hot. So things that grew in a different way grew before may not flourish as well now. In particular, my husband is distressed about his lychee tree, which has not borne at all. But we in small island developing states, if there's one thing we've got, it's big voices. So I don't know if you all recall, but back in 2015 at COP21, when there was a Paris Agreement, the SIDS of the world got together and promoted 1.5 to stay alive. It's something that still stays with me because I remember how proud I felt that as really tiny states, we were there together petitioning and demanding change. And we had the Paris Climate Agreement, and I remember feeling so convinced that we were on our way to solving this. But those commitments have not been met. And the commitments have not been met, the world continues to warm, our climate targets continue to seem to run away from us. A lot of those, now we need to look instead of mitigation, instead to adaptation, addressing carbon prices, building and resource efficiency standards, and renewable energy mandates. So there are a lot of these things that, again, come back to us as building professionals and people who work in the development world. But in 2022, I came with hope again. I live in hope. The Bridgetown Initiative was established in Barbados by Prime Minister Mia Mottley. And at COP27 in 2022 as well, we moved on from saying you shouldn't, let's try to contain, instead to getting right down to talking about loss and damage. And saying it is real, we're being affected, and there's no way we can survive without some other kinds of interventions. So this loss and damage, one is looking at financing, at money, at funding to help. And this gives us huge opportunities in SIDS for infrastructure development and housing. So let's talk about those opportunities. So important to say that there is a figure that I heard recently that blew my mind, that it said that nearly half of the buildings that will exist by the middle of the century, by 2050, have not been built yet. What does that mean? That means we still have an opportunity to do all those things better, to build better, to find better ways to do what we do and what we must do. And so doing it better is critical. So how do we move towards a better built environment? A better built environment will be sustainable and resilient. That is not only able to withstand impacts, not only able to recover quickly, but also able to thrive in an uncertain future. Then we want to look at things that are smart. And I'm not using SMART here as an acronym, I'm using SMART as just SMART. Which is we want to build an environment that is more flexible and multi-purpose, that can consider many ways to use a space. How can spaces be used in different ways? How can a single space be used by different groups at different times? I heard Planner talking about, there are places that are empty when at a certain time of day or a certain time of year. How can we find other uses for things instead of having single purpose buildings all the time? As well as things like adaptive reuse. How can we reuse things that we're not using as we used to? How can we use those in a different way? Retrofit, as well as looking at technology for efficiency and the circularity of the buildings that we create. Another important part, of course, is inclusivity, which is some of the work I was doing with UN Women, which looks at our vulnerable and marginalized communities and how they can be involved. And that can include everything from, in fact, we recognize as women as being a vulnerable community, and then the differently abled as a vulnerable community, indigenous people as a vulnerable community, and there are a variety of people who, for some reason, are not able to respond as simply as the rest of us. And then participatory, looking at how we do development to include communities. How do we include all of those groups that are not usually included as a part of community and development? Healthy, So with increasing heat, with changing climates, and also just with changing lifestyles, we are doing more things indoor. There is a huge increase in the things we do indoor, and as things change, we'll be doing increasingly amount of things will not happen outdoors. That means we need to consider things like air quality, visibility, how we use indoor and how we use indoor spaces better. And then, of course, affordability. Looking at ways that we can get financing internationally, land availability, and use. So, I want to talk about the residential market, just briefly. Globally, property remains a significant store of wealth. Often it's the most tangible, the most valuable tangible asset that an individual or a family owns is their house. And it is a long-term commitment for many people. Real estate is still worth more than global equity and bond markets combined, and is almost 4 times the size of our global GDP. More than 75% of the value in real estate is in residential property. There's a value there, with commercial accounting for 13 and agricultural down to 11. So even as I'm also a real estate agent, and I will tell you I like working in commercials, a lot of money and a lot more money, a lot less emotions, but the value still remains. Residential is still the core of our real estate development industry globally. And so how are we going to be looking at building sustainability? So reduction in their environmental impacts, looking at circularity, increase in property values and rental prices. These are some of the things that, by moving towards more sustainable buildings, some of the things that we will see happening. So we do have, we are seeing for sure increased property value and price and rental rates based on the sustainability of a building and what the elements that are included in there. Of course, it can affect the operation and maintenance costs, and there are many jurisdictions where there are tax incentives and other kinds of incentives made available for building sustainably. Of course, building sustainably also gives us the opportunity for, when we consider biophilic design, engaging more with plants and views for well-being and health for the occupants and users of a building. And increasingly, the real estate market is moving towards a preference for developments that engage in sustainable development. I want to talk quickly about sustainability standards. So there are a number of standards across different types of development and different types of construction, including things like LEED and BREEAM and the Living Building Challenge. And I had the joy in Jamaica of working on Jamaica's first net zero energy building, and we used the Living Building Challenge as our standard for that project. Mainly because as a small island developing state, we were really struggling to achieve LEED, which is one of the best recognized, but we were really struggling to achieve it because of the size of the country. We work also very much in our tourism sectors using sustainability standards like Green Globe and EarthCheck. And I've highlighted at the bottom the World Bank IFC's EDGE certification as an emerging certification that is particularly affordable. So whereas a number of the others have, some of the barriers to some of the others is that they're not cheap. So it costs a bit to register, it costs a bit to train, it costs a bit to maintain licenses and things like that. The World Bank, recognizing that sustainability has become core to development, is promoting their EDGE program, has at much lower prices, has a website that's free to use, and it allows you to put almost any project into the EDGE assessment process to determine the sustainability of your project. This is a really big game changer in my view, because that takes away a lot of the cost, which is a barrier to entry. I did a lookup on Bermuda and your green building LEED certifications and found 4 projects, which is very good. I'm impressed. We struggled in a long time in Jamaica to get our first project, and we couldn't achieve platinum. So I'm very proud to say that the Chubb building was updated to platinum, highest ranking in 2019. So well done, Bermuda, good example. But this, of course, is difficult to implement when you get into things like affordable housing. And so that's why we want the more universal and affordable options like we found with World Bank. And so just to come down to this, one of the key things I want to talk about in terms of how affordable it can be is the energy pyramid, which is actually, it's an anything pyramid if you ask me, anything that we use up, anything in terms of resources. And it essentially says that at the bottom, the most important part, the biggest impact you can have in energy is conservation. That's simply only using it when you need to. And then if you do need to, when you use it efficiently. And once you're already using as little as possible and as efficiently as possible, then you try to find an alternative source. And this pyramid can be applicable to many things. And it's a sign for us that solutions do not necessarily have to be costly. And often the core for solutions in sustainability and in being sustainable is about mindset and about attitude, much more so than fancy equipment and adding things. So, I put in edge here just to highlight that is one of the ways that we can seek certification for things like large-scale housing for government projects that would not necessarily be able to afford other types of certifications. And in wrapping up, I come back to this little house, which I like to use because often when I talk about technology and certification and all the fancy things that are happening in the world, you feel that it's something far away and expensive. And I just want to come back to that fact that we have quite a bit of traditional knowledge of sustainability. This little house is actually an excellent example of a sustainable building. It's a raised structure, so it's above the floods, it's also above mosquitoes. You get cross ventilation, rainwater collection from the steep roofs. It's wind resistant. The veranda takes the heat off the interior spaces. The fretwork filters the sunlight. The louvers, this one doesn't have louvers, but louvers help you to manage airflow. And all of these things are to say that the solutions may not need to be brand new, high-tech, fancy, or expensive solutions. There's quite a bit to be learned and to be recognized from our traditional knowledge of sustainability. And I just want to touch on placemaking, which is what I do now that I'm retired from government. What I do now is I think about how spaces can be great and beautiful. And one of the things about placemaking, these are some of the elements of placemaking. It's identifying, understanding, and honoring the unique history and character of a place. And I find that Bermuda is just fascinating to me. Things like moon gates. And I think Bermuda has such a strong architectural style. I think it's important that it be shared with other small island developing states, that the things that you routinely do to solve your climatic issues, a lot of us in other parts of the world don't do it. And I think your Bermudan architect should be out talking about the uniqueness of Bermudan architectural style. Another important part of placemaking is using and giving consideration to community-sensitive names, to understand how the names of things are an important thing. What I am called, or what I choose to be called, is important. And we think that more with so many things, that people want to honor the real name or the true name and be sensitive to naming. And celebrating culture. A thing about, important part about placemaking is using a place. You don't want to make good places and then they stay there. An important part is using places, celebrating a culture through an annual calendar of events. This is a core part of tourism. People travel, save up to go to places to see the sites, the monuments in other people's cultures. And so it is a huge underpinning of tourism, but it's even better for building strong communities. Bermuda Day, which I understand I'm going to miss, is an example of that, because I think it's very cool. When I was reading about Bermuda Day, very cool to say that's the first day you're going to sea, it's the first day that you wear Bermuda shorts. And those are the things that create in your mind the uniqueness and specialness of a place. And my bad for not realizing, or I would have made a bigger effort to stay for Bermuda Day. And there I suggest that perhaps this conference could be a part of an annual Bermuda Day. So it's something of where we celebrating development in Bermuda every year. And it's a means of doing continuous improvement as you consider that. So I'm going to end with this quote, which is that the places where people want to live, and I added work and play because we live, work, and play, that are sustainable do not happen by chance. They are the product of visionary thinking and commitment by highly skilled civic and national leaders, developers and professionals with full engagement and support of local partners and communities. And this is what you have started today, and I hope you continue for years to come. So congratulations, as somebody who loves buildings and development. Congratulations on this event. I know it's your first, and may you have many more. Thank you.